The rifle shot split the morning air, followed by the ping of metal as the last target fell. Lillian Nash lowered her Winchester, smoke still curling from the barrel, her smile barely containing the triumph bubbling inside her chest. She had done it. She had just beaten the most renowned sharpshooter in all of Raton, New Mexico, Thomas Yates, whose cocky grin had disappeared the moment her bullet found its mark. The year was 1881, and the New Mexico territory was still wild and untamed, much like the spirits of those who sought their fortunes there. The shooting contest had drawn nearly the entire town, and the silence that followed Lillian's victory shot was deafening. Then came a slow clap, starting from Thomas Yates himself. His weathered hat tipped back, revealing eyes the color of a summer sky. His lean frame straightened from where he had been leaning against the fence post, observing her final shot with a mixture of disbelief and something that made Lillian's heart skip a beat. "Well, I'll be damned," Thomas said, his voice carrying across the makeshift shooting range. "Never thought I'd see the day when a lady would outshoot me." He strode toward her, his spurs jingling with each step, and the crowd parted to make way. Lillian stood her ground, rifle still warm in her hands. At 22, she had spent the last 4 years proving herself in a world that believed women belonged behind stoves, not behind rifles. Her father's ranch had taught her otherwise, had taught her that survival in this harsh land required more than just feminine wiles. "Perhaps you weren't looking hard enough, Mr. Yates," she replied, lifting her chin. Her auburn hair was coming loose from its practical braid, framing her face in wild tendrils that caught the morning sun. Thomas stopped a foot away from her. The crowd around them had erupted into excited chatter. Money-exchanging hands more had bet against her than for her, which meant a few lucky souls were about to get very rich. "Perhaps I wasn't," he agreed, his voice dropping so only she could hear. Then, with a sudden movement that took her by surprise, he knelt on one knee before her. The crowd fell silent again, a wave of hushes spreading outward from where they stood. "Miss Nash," Thomas said, his voice clear and strong despite the intimacy of the moment, "I've been beaten by the best shot I've ever seen. Would you do me the honor," he paused, and his grin spread wide across his face, transforming him from handsome to irresistible, "of marrying me before someone else does?" Gasps and whistles erupted from the crowd. Lillian stared down at the man before her, this stranger who had just proposed marriage based on nothing more than her ability to shoot straight. Her father would have a conniption. "Mr. Yates," she finally managed, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart, "I believe conventional courtship involves dinner first, not ammunition." Thomas's laugh was rich and genuine. He rose to his feet, dusting off his knee. "Then I'd be honored if you joined me for dinner tonight, Miss Nash, at the Grand Hotel, 7 o'clock. Lillian should have refused. Any sensible woman would have. But she had never claimed to be sensible, only practical. And there was something about Thomas Yates that made her curious, something beyond his reputation as the fastest draw in 3 territories. "I'll consider it," she replied, which wasn't a yes, but wasn't entirely a no either. "I'll take those odds," Thomas said, tipping his hat to her. "I've got a feeling they're better than the ones I had in this shooting match." As he turned and walked away, the crowd swarmed around them both, congratulating Lillian on her win and teasing Thomas about his proposal. Lillian found herself watching his retreating back, wondering what had possessed him to make such an outlandish proposition, and what had possessed her not to refuse it outright. Little did she know that this impulsive moment would change the course of her life forever. Lillian's father, George Nash, was less than impressed by the day's events. A stern man weathered by years of hard living, He had built their modest ranch with nothing but determination and sweat. Now, as Lillian recounted the shooting contest over supper, his frown deepened with each word. "You accepted a dinner invitation from Thomas Yates?" he asked, setting down his fork with deliberate precision. "The same Thomas Yates who's rumored to have killed 3 men in Colorado." "4," Lillian corrected absently, then caught herself at her father's horrified expression. "But all in self-defense, from what I've heard. He's respected in town, father. Sheriff Wilson speaks highly of him." "Sheriff Wilson would speak highly of the devil himself if he thought there was a free drink in it," her father muttered. "Lillian, you can't be serious about this dinner. The man proposed marriage to you in front of the entire town after knowing you for all of 5 minutes. Lillian poked at her potatoes. "It wasn't a serious proposal, it was a jest. The whole town's talking about it." "Jest or not, your reputation, my reputation," Lillian interrupted, "is already that of a woman who can outshoot most men and who helps run a ranch. I don't think dinner with Mr. Yates will damage it any further in the eyes of those who already disapprove." Her father's expression softened. Since Lillian's mother had died when she was 12, it had been just the two of them, struggling to keep the ranch afloat. He had taught her everything he knew: riding, shooting, the business of cattle, because there had been no one else to help. Now, looking at his daughter, he saw a woman where he still wanted to see his little girl. "You're not going alone," he said finally. "Father, Mrs. Rodriguez will accompany you as chaperone, or you don't go at all." Lillian sighed but nodded her agreement. Mrs. Rodriguez was their housekeeper, a widow in her 50s with sharp eyes that missed nothing and a heart that was kinder than she let on. "Fine," Lillian conceded. "But she sits at another table. I won't have Mr. Yates think I need a nursemaid." Her father grunted his assent, and they finished their meal in silence. But as Lillian rose to clear the dishes, he spoke again. "Why did you accept his invitation, Lillian? There are plenty of respectable young men in Raton who have shown interest." Lillian paused, considering the question. The answer that came to her was not one she was ready to share. That in the moment, Thomas Yates had looked at her with admiration rather than condescension. Something inside her had shifted. "Curiosity," she said instead. "And perhaps a bit of pride. No one's ever proposed because I beat them at something before." Her father's laugh was short but genuine. "Well, just remember, curiosity killed the cat." "But satisfaction brought it back," Lillian finished with a smile. The Grand Hotel was the finest establishment in Raton, which wasn't saying much by the standards of larger cities, but it boasted real glass windows, a genuine piano in the dining room, and tablecloths that were changed daily. Lillian arrived at 7 precisely, wearing her best dress, a deep green affair that her mother had sewn for special occasions, altered over the years to fit her growing frame. Mrs. Rodriguez followed a few steps behind, her dark eyes already scanning the dining room as they entered. She spotted an empty table near the corner and nodded toward it, silently informing Lillian where she would be stationed for the evening. Thomas Yates rose from a table near the window as Lillian approached. He had traded his dusty riding clothes for a clean shirt and dark vest, his hair still damp from what must have been a recent bath. He looked different in this setting, less the dangerous gunslinger, more the respectable gentleman. "Miss Nash," he said, pulling out her chair. "I wasn't entirely sure you'd come." "I said I'd consider it," Lillian replied, settling into her seat. "I've considered it." Thomas's smile was warm as he retook his own seat. "And I'm grateful for the conclusion of your deliberations. You look beautiful, if you don't mind my saying so." Lillian did mind a little. Not the compliment itself, but the ease with which he delivered it, suggesting practice with many women before her. Still, she nodded her thanks. "I ordered a bottle of wine," Thomas continued, gesturing to the bottle already on the table. "I hope that's acceptable." "It is," Lillian said, though she rarely drank wine. Her father preferred whiskey on the rare occasions he indulged, and wine was an expensive luxury at the Nash ranch. A waiter arrived to pour their wine and take their order. Thomas recommended the steak, which Lillian accepted, more because she was too distracted by his presence to consider the menu properly than because of any particular desire for beef. Once they were alone again, Thomas raised his glass. "To the finest shot in New Mexico territory." Lillian touched her glass to his. "You're not upset about losing." "To be beaten by mediocrity would be upsetting," Thomas replied. "To be beaten by excellence is educational. Who taught you to shoot like that?" "My father, initially. After my mother passed, he decided I should know how to defend myself and the ranch. Then I taught myself, practicing whenever I could spare the time and ammunition." Thomas nodded, genuine interest in his expression. "It shows. Your form is unconventional but effective. Most men would be too proud to admit they could learn something from watching you. And you're not most men." The question came out more challenging than Lillian had intended. Thomas took a sip of his wine, considering her over the rim of his glass. "I try not to be," he said finally. "Pride has its place, but so does recognition of skill. False pride just gets a man killed out here." There was something in the way he said it that hinted at personal experience, a shadow crossing his features before he smiled again, changing the subject. "Tell me about your ranch," he said. "I've heard the Nash property runs along the eastern foothills." Lillian found herself talking more than she normally would, describing the challenges of the last cattle drive, the new breeding stock they'd acquired, the constant battle against rustlers and drought. Thomas listened attentively, asking questions that showed he understood ranching beyond the romantic notions many townsfolk held. By the time their steaks arrived, Lillian was surprised to find herself genuinely enjoying his company. Thomas had a way of making her feel heard, a rarity in a world where men typically spoke over her or dismissed her opinions entirely. "And what about you, Mr. Yates?" she asked as they began their meal. "The rumors about your past are colorful." Thomas cut into his steak with precision. "Some more accurate than others, I imagine. What specific colors have you heard painted about me?" "That you were a lawman in Colorado, that you've killed 4 men, that you came to New Mexico to escape something or someone." Lillian watched his face carefully as she spoke. "3 of those things are true," Thomas admitted. "I was a deputy in Silverton for 2 years, and yes, I've had to take lives in the line of duty for men who gave me no choice. As for escaping—" He paused, his knife stilling on his plate. "I came to New Mexico for a fresh start, not to run from anything specific. Sometimes a man just needs new horizons." "And now," Lillian pressed, "what do you do now, Mr. Yates? Call me Thomas, please." His smile returned. "Currently, I work for the railroad as a security consultant. I travel the line from Trinidad to Santa Fe, ensuring the company's interests are protected." "That sounds very respectable," Lillian observed, a hint of skepticism in her voice. Thomas laughed. "You say that like it's disappointing. Were you hoping I was still living by my gun?" Lillian felt her cheeks warm. "No, of course not. The way people talk about you, people prefer legends to truth," Thomas interrupted gently. "The truth is usually much more mundane. I'm 30 years old, Miss Nash. I've seen enough violence to last several lifetimes. These days, I prefer preventing trouble to ending it with bullets." The sincerity in his voice was impossible to doubt. Lillian found herself reassessing everything she'd heard about Thomas Yates. The dangerous gunslinger image faded somewhat, replaced by the man sitting across from her, intelligent, thoughtful, and far more complex than rumors suggested. "Now," Thomas said, his tone lightening, "I believe I owe you an explanation for my rather dramatic proposal this morning." Lillian took a sip of her wine. "I was wondering when we'd get to that. The truth is, Miss Nash, Lillian, if I may, I've been watching you for some time. Not in a manner that would alarm your father," he added quickly, seeing her expression change. "But I've seen you in town, dealing with merchants who try to cheat you, handling your father's business with more sense than most men twice your age. I've admired your capability." "My capability," Lillian repeated, unsure whether to be flattered or offended. "Not the usual quality men admire in women." "I'm not usual men," Thomas reminded her with a small smile. "And when you stepped up to that shooting line today, with half the town betting against you and whispering behind their hands. When you hit every target without hesitation, without showing a hint of the pressure you must have felt." He shook his head slightly, as if still amazed. "In that moment, I knew I'd found someone extraordinary. The proposal was impulsive, I admit, but not insincere." Lillian studied him, trying to determine if this was a practiced speech he delivered to impress women. But his eyes held no guile, only a warmth that made her heart beat faster. "Mr. Yates, Thomas," she corrected herself. "I'm flattered, truly. But surely you understand that marriage requires more foundation than mutual admiration of shooting skills." "Of course," he agreed readily. "Which is why I'm asking for the chance to court you properly. Today is just the beginning, if you'll allow it." Before Lillian could respond, a commotion at the entrance to the dining room drew their attention. 3 men had entered, trail dusty and hard-faced, their hands hovering near their holstered guns. The lead man's gaze swept the room and locked on Thomas. "Yates," he called, his voice silencing all other conversation in the room. "Thought you could hide in this backwater." Thomas's expression hardened, but he remained seated. "I'm not hiding, Jenkins, and I'm in the middle of dinner with a lady. Whatever business you think we have can wait." The man, Jenkins, sneered. "The business of my brother's death can't wait. You shot him down like a dog in Trinidad." "Your brother drew on me first," Thomas replied, his voice level but carrying clearly across the now silent dining room. "The sheriff and 3 witnesses confirmed it was self-defense." "Witnesses can be bought," Jenkins spat. "And now I'm going to finish what my brother started." Lillian's heart pounded as she realized what was happening. Mrs. Rodriguez had risen from her corner table, clearly uncertain whether to approach or flee. The other diners were pressing back against the walls, leaving an open space between Thomas and the 3 men. Thomas finally stood, placing himself between Lillian and the threat. "Take your hand off your gun, Jenkins. I don't want to kill another member of your family, but I will if you force me." Jenkins's face contorted with rage. "You'll pay for what you did." His hand dropped to his holster, but before he could clear leather, a rifle shot boomed through the room. Jenkins howled in pain as the bullet tore through his shoulder, his gun clattering to the floor. Lillian stood beside Thomas, her father's rifle, which she had left with Mrs. Rodriguez for safekeeping, smoking in her hands. She had reacted instinctively, aiming to wound rather than kill. "The next one goes through your heart," she said calmly, though her insides were churning. "All 3 of you, hands up where I can see them." The 2 men flanking Jenkins raised their hands slowly, shock evident on their faces. Jenkins himself was clutching his bleeding shoulder, his expression a mixture of pain and disbelief. "You bitch," he gasped. Thomas's gun was in his hand now, though Lillian hadn't even seen him draw. "That's no way to address a lady," he said mildly. "Especially one who just saved your life by choosing not to put that bullet through your heart." The sheriff arrived moments later, alerted by the gunshot. He took in the scene, Jenkins bleeding, his companions with their hands up, Thomas and Lillian holding them at gunpoint. "What in tarnation is going on here?" Sheriff Wilson demanded. "These men interrupted our dinner with threats and attempted murder," Thomas explained, never taking his eyes off the trio. "Miss Nash was kind enough to intervene before I had to take more permanent measures." The sheriff sighed heavily. "Jenkins, you fool. I warned you what would happen if you came looking for trouble." He gestured to his deputies. "Get him to the doctor, then lock all three of them up." As the men were led away, Jenkins still cursing and threatening, the room slowly returned to normal. Conversations resumed, though considerably more animated than before, with all eyes occasionally darting to Thomas and Lillian's table. Thomas holstered his weapon and turned to Lillian, genuine concern in his eyes. "Are you all right?" Lillian realized she was trembling slightly, the adrenaline of the moment beginning to fade. "I'm fine. I just reacted." "You saved that man's life," Thomas said quietly. "If he had drawn on me, I wouldn't have aimed for the shoulder." Mrs. Rodriguez hurried over, her face pale with worry. "Señorita Lillian, we must go home immediately. Your father will understand that I couldn't leave in the middle of an attempted murder," Lillian finished firmly, though she knew her father would be furious about the entire incident. She handed the rifle back to Mrs. Rodriguez. "Please, give us a few more minutes to collect ourselves." The older woman hesitated but nodded, retreating to her table though keeping a watchful eye on them. Thomas and Lillian sat back down, their steaks cold and forgotten. The wine, however, seemed suddenly necessary, and Lillian took a long swallow from her glass. "I apologize for the interruption," Thomas said, his voice low. "This is not how I imagined our evening would go." Lillian studied him across the table. "Is this a regular occurrence in your life, Mr. Yates? Men seeking revenge for brothers you've killed?" Thomas winced slightly at her direct question. "No, not regular, but my past does occasionally catch up with me. Jenkins's brother really did draw first. He was wanted for 2 stagecoach robberies, and I was escorting a witness to his trial when he tried to silence her." Lillian nodded slowly. "I believe you. But it does make me wonder if accepting your courtship would mean regularly shooting men in dining rooms." To her surprise, Thomas laughed, the tension in his shoulders easing. "I certainly hope not, though I must say your aim is impressive even when under pressure." "My father always says that's when aim matters most," Lillian replied, a small smile finally returning to her lips. Thomas reached across the table, hesitating before gently taking her hand. His touch was warm, calloused from years of work and weapons, but somehow comforting rather than threatening. "Lillian Nash," he said seriously, "I think you may be the most remarkable woman I've ever met. And while I understand that tonight's events might give you second thoughts about my courtship, I hope you'll still consider it. I promise that not every dinner with me ends in gunfire." Lillian should have withdrawn her hand. She should have thanked him politely for the dinner and left with Mrs. Rodriguez, putting this wild evening behind her. Instead, she found herself turning her hand to clasp his. "I think," she said slowly, "that I would like to see what a second dinner might bring, Mr. Yates, though perhaps somewhere less public next time." Thomas's smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains, gradual, then brilliant. "I know just the place," he promised, "and I guarantee no gunfights." As they finally left the restaurant, Lillian was acutely aware of the stares following them, of the story that would race through Raton by morning, how the Nash girl had not only beaten Thomas Yates in a shooting contest, but had saved him from an ambush during their dinner together. Her reputation, already unusual, would become truly extraordinary after tonight. Strangely, she found she didn't mind. There was something freeing about stepping fully into the person she had always been, rather than the person society expected her to be. and walking beside Thomas Yates, feeling his steady presence at her shoulder as he escorted her and Mrs. Rodriguez to their wagon. Lillian had the distinct feeling that her life had just veered onto a path she had never anticipated, but one that might lead somewhere wonderful. The Nash Ranch sat nestled against the foothills east of Raton, a modest spread compared to some but well-maintained and productive. The main house was built of sturdy logs with a stone foundation, expanded over the years as George Nash's fortunes had allowed. A broad porch wrapped around two sides, offering views of both the distant mountains and the rolling grasslands where their cattle grazed. It was on this porch that Lillian found herself the following morning, mending a bridle that had broken the day before. Her fingers worked deftly with the leather as her mind turned over the events of the previous evening. The shooting, Thomas's steady calm in the face of danger, the way his eyes had held hers when he asked to court her properly. "You're smiling at that bridle like it just paid you a compliment." Lillian looked up to find her father watching her from the doorway, coffee mug in hand. Despite his words, his expression was serious. "Just thinking," she replied, setting the bridle aside. George Nash settled into the rocking chair beside her, the wood creaking beneath his weight. For several moments they sat in silence, looking out over the land they both loved. "Mrs. Rodriguez told me what happened," he said finally. "Said you shot a man." "In the shoulder," Lillian clarified. "He was drawing on Thomas Mr. Yates. It was self-defense. Our self-defense," she amended. Her father nodded slowly. "And why was this man drawing on your dinner companion?" Lillian sighed. There was no point hiding the truth. Her father would hear it in town anyway. "He was the brother of a wanted man that Thomas had to kill some months back." "In self-defense as well, from what the sheriff confirmed." "I see." George took a long sip of his coffee. "So in addition to being a former lawman with a reputation for gunplay, Mr. Yates also has vengeful families following him around." "It's not like that," Lillian protested. "He works for the railroad now. Security consultation. It's respectable work." "Respectable," her father repeated, a hint of skepticism in his voice. "And does this respectable railroad man intend to call on you again?" Lillian felt heat rise to her cheeks but met her father's gaze steadily. "He asked permission to court me properly. I said I would consider a second dinner." George Nash's weathered face gave little away as he digested this information. At 52, he had seen enough of life to know that opposing his headstrong daughter outright would only strengthen her resolve. Still, concern carved deep lines around his eyes. "Lillian," he said carefully, "you know I've always respected your judgment even when I disagree with it. You've proven yourself capable of running this ranch alongside me, making hard decisions, handling situations most women your age wouldn't dream of facing." "But," Lillian prompted, hearing the unspoken word, "but Thomas Yates is a different kind of challenge altogether. Men like him, men who have lived by the gun, they carry death with them, even when they try to leave it behind. I've seen it before." Lillian thought about the calm way Thomas had faced Jenkins, the control in his movements even when threatened. "I think he's trying to build something different now, Father. And isn't that what we all want? The chance to be more than our pasts." George set down his coffee mug with a soft thunk. "Your mother would have liked that sentiment," he said, a rare mention of his late wife. "She always believed people could change." "Do you?" Lillian asked quietly. Her father was silent for a long moment. "I believe intention matters," he said finally. "If Yates truly wants a different life, truly cares for you, well, that's something. But intention isn't always enough, Lillian. Some men are marked by violence, shaped by it until they can't exist without it." "I don't think Thomas is one of them," Lillian said, though she wondered if one dinner was enough to make such a judgment. "For your sake, I hope you're right." George rose from his chair, his knees cracking slightly. "If he calls on you again, I want to meet him properly. Not as the man who proposed to my daughter after a shooting contest, but as a suitor with serious intentions." Lillian nodded, relief washing through her. It wasn't approval exactly, but it was an opening. "Thank you, Father." "Don't thank me yet," George warned, though a hint of a smile touched his lips. "I'm still reserving judgment. And Lillian." "Yes. Next time you go to dinner in town, maybe leave the rifle at home. Most men find it intimidating when their dinner companion is better armed than they are." Lillian laughed, the tension between them easing. "I doubt Thomas Yates is most men." "No," her father agreed, his expression sobering again. "That's what worries me." 3 days passed without word from Thomas, and Lillian told herself she wasn't disappointed. She had plenty to occupy her time. The ranch's ledgers needed updating. The south pasture fence required mending, and a new foal had been born to their best mare, requiring careful monitoring. Still, when a messenger arrived from town on the 4th day, Lillian found herself hurrying to meet him, trying not to appear too eager. The message was simple. "Miss Nash, would you do me the honor of joining me for dinner tomorrow evening at 6 o'clock? I promise a more peaceful venue than our last encounter. Your father is also welcome, should he wish to accompany you. Respectfully yours, Thomas Yates." George read the note over her shoulder and harumphed. "Well, at least the man has sense enough to include me in the invitation. Will you come?" Lillian asked, trying to keep her voice neutral. Her father studied her face for a moment. "Do you want me to come, or would you prefer I conveniently find ranch business to attend to?" Lillian smiled at his perceptiveness. "I think it would be better if you met him properly. But perhaps you could find that ranch business shortly after dinner." George Nash's laugh was rusty but genuine. "Transparent as glass, just like your mother. All right, I'll meet the man, share a meal, and then make myself scarce provided I don't find any reason to object to him." "Thank you, Father." Lillian impulsively kissed his weathered cheek, then hurried to write a reply accepting the invitation. The following evening found them arriving at a small, well-kept house on the outskirts of Raton. It was a modest structure, but the front yard was neatly maintained, with a hitching post freshly painted and a small garden showing signs of recent planting. "He owns property," George muttered as they approached the front door. "The man works for the railroad, courts my daughter, and still finds time for gardening. Perhaps he's trying to impress us," Lillian suggested, smoothing her skirt nervously. Before her father could respond, the door opened to reveal Thomas, dressed in a clean shirt and vest, his dark hair combed neatly back from his forehead. Without his customary hat, he looked younger, more approachable. "Miss Nash, Mr. Nash," he greeted them, stepping back to allow them entry. "Thank you for accepting my invitation." The interior of the house was simply but comfortably furnished. A sturdy table laid for dinner, bookshelves lining one wall, a stone fireplace providing both warmth and light. The sense of cooking food filled the air, making Lillian's stomach rumble appreciatively. "I didn't realize you were a man of property, Mr. Yates," George said, looking around with undisguised curiosity. "Recent acquisition," Thomas replied, offering them seats at the table. "I've been saving from my railroad work. Raton seems a good place to put down roots." George's eyebrows rose slightly at this, and Lillian could see him reassessing Thomas in light of this information. A drifter was one thing. A man investing in property was another matter entirely. "You cook as well, Mr. Yates?" Lillian asked, noting the lack of servants or hired help. Thomas smiled, a hint of self-consciousness in his expression. "Basic trail cooking mostly. For tonight, I've had some help from Mrs. Ortiz at the hotel. She was kind enough to prepare most of the meal so I wouldn't poison my guests." The honesty of this admission drew a chuckle from George and a warm smile from Lillian. As Thomas served the food, a hearty beef stew with freshly baked bread conversation flowed more easily than Lillian had dared hope. Thomas asked George intelligent questions about ranching, displaying genuine interest in the challenges and rewards of the work. He spoke of his own background, raised on a small farm in Missouri, before heading west at 18, working various jobs from cowhand to freight driver before his time as a lawman. "And how did you come to work for the railroad?" George asked, tearing off another piece of bread to sop up the rich gravy of his stew. "After leaving the sheriff's office in Colorado, I spent some time doing security work for various businesses," Thomas explained. "The railroad approached me last year when they were having trouble with bandits targeting their payroll shipments. I helped design a new system that's reduced their losses significantly." "Legitimate work," George noted, his tone suggesting he was grudgingly impressed. "Yes, sir," Thomas agreed. "I've had my fill of badges and bullets. These days, I prefer prevention to confrontation." "Yet confrontation seems to find you anyway," George observed, referring to the incident at the Grand Hotel. Thomas met the older man's gaze steadily. "Some parts of our past don't let go easily, Mr. Nash. I can't change what I've done or who might hold grudges because of it. But I can choose how I live now, and I choose a quieter path." The sincerity in his voice was impossible to doubt. Lillian found herself studying Thomas as he spoke with her father, noting the way his hands capable of lightning-fast draws moved gently as he served more stew. The way his eyes, sharp enough to hit distant targets, softened when they met hers across the table. After dinner, Thomas surprised them both by producing a chess set. "Do you play, Mr. Nash? I've heard you're quite the strategist." George's eyebrows rose again. "Now, how would you hear something like that? Small towns have long memories," Thomas replied with a smile. "Mrs. Ortiz mentioned you used to play with the schoolteacher years back, said you rarely lost." This subtle flattery hit its mark. George Nash straightened in his chair, a competitive gleam entering his eye. "Well, it's been some time since I've had a worthy opponent." "Father," Lillian protested, "we shouldn't impose on Mr. Yates's evening further." "Nonsense," George interrupted. "The man has challenged me to chess. It would be impolite to refuse." Thomas caught Lillian's eye and winked so quickly she almost missed it. As the two men set up the board near the fireplace, Lillian realized that Thomas had cleverly engineered exactly what she had hoped for, a way for her father to be occupied while still feeling he was properly supervising their evening. "Perhaps Miss Nash would enjoy seeing the garden while there's still light," Thomas suggested innocently. "I've just planted some herbs that might interest her." George, already absorbed in contemplating his first move, waved a hand distractedly. "Yes, fine. Don't wander off, Lillian." "I wouldn't dream of it, Father," she replied solemnly, though her heart had begun to beat faster at the prospect of a few moments alone with Thomas. The garden was small but well planned, with neat rows of vegetable seedlings and a section dedicated to herbs and flowering plants. As they stepped outside into the golden light of early evening, Thomas offered Lillian his arm. "Your father is exactly as formidable as I expected," he said, guiding her along the narrow path between planted rows. "You've handled him remarkably well," Lillian admitted. "The chess was a particularly clever touch." Thomas laughed softly. "I may have done some research before inviting you both. A man should know what he's up against when courting a woman like you." The words "courting a woman like you" sent a pleasant shiver through Lillian. She was accustomed to being treated as an oddity in Raton, respected for her capabilities, but set apart by them as well. Thomas seemed to value those very qualities that others found challenging. "Is that what you're doing, Mr. Yates?" courting me?" She kept her tone light, though the question was anything but. Thomas stopped walking, turning to face her fully. In the slanting evening light, his blue eyes seemed deeper, more intense. "I believe I made my intentions clear at the shooting contest," he said, his voice low. "Though I admit the delivery was unorthodox. Proposing marriage to a woman you'd barely spoken to is beyond unorthodox," Lillian pointed out, though she couldn't help smiling at the memory. "In my defense, I've observed you for months," Thomas replied. "You negotiate with cattle buyers who try to cheat you. You stand your ground when men twice your size try to intimidate you. You shoot better than anyone I've ever seen. I knew who you were long before you knew I existed." "That sounds dangerously close to admitting you've been watching me, Mr. Yates," Lillian said, though the idea didn't disturb her as much as it probably should have. "In a small town like Raton, it's hard not to notice someone like you," Thomas said simply. "You shine, Lillian Nash. You always have." The compliment, delivered without flourish but with unmistakable sincerity, caught Lillian off guard. She had been complimented before, of course, on her appearance, her cooking, occasionally even her riding skills, but never on her essential self, the core of who she was. "I'm not sure what to say to that," she admitted. Thomas smiled, the corner of his mouth lifting in a way that made her heart skip. "You don't have to say anything. Just know that my interest in you goes far beyond your ability to outshoot me, impressive as that is." A call from inside the house interrupted them. "Lillian, Mr. Yates, it's getting dark out there." Thomas sighed, a flicker of disappointment crossing his features before he offered Lillian his arm again. "We should go in before your father decides I've compromised your virtue in the herb garden." Lillian laughed, taking his arm. "That would be quite a feat in full view of the neighbors' windows." "I'm resourceful," Thomas replied with mock seriousness, "but not that resourceful." As they returned inside, Lillian was acutely aware of the warm strength of his arm beneath her fingers, the clean scent of soap and leather that seemed to surround him, the way his steps naturally adjusted to match hers. Small things, perhaps, but they combined to create an impression of a man who was attentive in ways that mattered. The chess game had apparently ended in George's favor, though Thomas didn't seem particularly disappointed by the loss. After a final cup of coffee, George announced it was time they headed home, the ranch chores requiring an early start the next day. At the door, Thomas shook George's hand firmly. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Nash. I hope we'll have the chance to play chess again soon." "HMPH," George replied, though the sound held less suspicion than earlier. "You need work on your queen's gambit, but you play a respectable game." From George Nash, this was high praise indeed. Lillian caught Thomas's eye and saw that he understood the significance of her father's comment. "Miss Nash," Thomas said, turning to Lillian, "might I call on you this Sunday, perhaps for a ride if the weather permits?" Before Lillian could respond, George cut in. "Sunday is church, Mr. Yates. We attend regularly." "Of course," Thomas nodded. "I would be honored to escort you both to services, and perhaps we might enjoy that ride afterward." George studied him for a moment, then gave a short nod. "Acceptable. We'll expect you at 10. As they drove home in their wagon, the stars beginning to emerge in the vast New Mexico sky, Lillian glanced at her father's profile. "Well, what do you think of him now?" George was silent for so long that Lillian thought he might not answer. Finally, he sighed deeply. "He's not what I expected," he admitted. "There's more to him than his reputation suggests. He's educated, thoughtful. The house is a good sign, shows he's thinking of permanence." "But," Lillian prompted, hearing the reservation in her father's voice. "But men like that, men who have lived hard and violent lives, they carry scars, Lillian. Not just on their bodies, but deeper. The kind that wake them in the night sweating and reaching for weapons. The kind that can make them dangerous, even when they don't mean to be. Lillian thought about this, remembering the steady calm in Thomas's eyes even when faced with Jenkins's threats, the careful control in his movements. "I think," she said slowly, "that Thomas Yates is very aware of his own capacity for violence. That's why he's so careful, so controlled. He doesn't want to be that man anymore." George glanced at her, surprise in his expression. "You've given this thought?" "Of course I have," Lillian replied. "I'm not some swooning girl dazzled by a handsome face and a dramatic proposal. I see him clearly, Father, the good and the potential bad." George's weathered face softened slightly. "Your mother would be proud of the woman you've become, Lillian. She always said you had her heart and my head, a dangerous combination." Lillian smiled at the rare mention of her mother. "Is that why you're giving Thomas a chance?" "Because of what Mother would think, partly," George admitted. "And partly because I've raised you to make your own judgments. If you see something worth knowing in Thomas Yates, then I owe it to you to look for it too." The words warmed Lillian more than any outright approval could have. Her father was treating her as an adult, capable of her own choices, even while offering his guidance. It was a gift she hadn't expected but valued deeply. "Thank you, Father," she said softly. George harumphed again, but reached over to pat her hand awkwardly. "Don't thank me yet. I haven't decided whether he's good enough for you, but I'm willing to keep watching." Lillian smiled into the darkness. For her father, that was practically a blessing. Sunday arrived with clear skies and a gentle breeze, perfect weather for the ride Thomas had proposed. Lillian dressed with particular care for church, selecting a blue dress that her mother had always said brought out the gold flecks in her hazel eyes. Thomas arrived precisely at 10, driving a well-maintained buggy pulled by a handsome bay gelding. He had dressed formally for church, his usual trail clothes replaced by a dark suit that fit his broad shoulders perfectly. His hat, immaculately brushed, was held respectfully in his hands as he greeted them. "Miss Nash, Mr. Nash," he said, helping Lillian into the buggy with a touch that was both proper and somehow intimate. "You look lovely this morning," he added quietly, meant for her ears alone. The small Baptist church in Raton was the social center of the community as much as a place of worship. As they arrived, Lillian was acutely aware of the curious glances cast their way. The shooting contest, the incident at the hotel, and now Thomas escorting her to church, it was more gossip than Raton had enjoyed in months. Mrs. Peterson, the banker's wife, hurried over as they entered the churchyard. "Lillian, dear, how lovely to see you," she gushed, her eyes flicking curiously to Thomas. "And with company, I see." "Mrs. Peterson, may I introduce Mr. Thomas Yates?" Lillian said smoothly. "Mr. Yates, Mrs. Peterson is our banker's wife and the president of the Ladies' Aid Society." Thomas bowed slightly. "A pleasure, madam. I've heard much about your charitable work in the community." This was precisely the right thing to say. Mrs. Peterson preened visibly, launching into a detailed description of their current fundraising efforts for the school's new roof. Thomas listened attentively, asking questions that suggested genuine interest. By the time they entered the church, Thomas had been introduced to nearly every prominent citizen of Raton, handling each encounter with a charm that surprised Lillian. The dangerous gunslinger of reputation was nowhere to be seen. Instead, Thomas presented himself as a respectable businessman, polite and well-spoken. During the service, Lillian was conscious of Thomas beside her in the pew, his shoulder occasionally brushing hers as they stood for hymns. He sang in a pleasant baritone, knew the responses without prompting, and listened to Reverend Clark's sermon with apparent interest. "You've done this before," she whispered during a prayer, earning a quick smile from Thomas. My mother was devoted to her church, he murmured back. Some habits stick, even through years of drifting. This glimpse into his past, the mention of a mother who had raised him with religious values, added another layer to Lillian's understanding of the complex man beside her. She found herself wanting to know more about his childhood, his family, the path that had led him from a God-fearing boy to a man who had killed 4 others, and was now seeking redemption. After the service, there was the usual socializing in the churchyard. Thomas was drawn into conversation with several of the town's businessmen, while Lillian found herself surrounded by curious women. "My dear," Mrs. Wilson, the sheriff's wife, said in a low voice, "is it true that Thomas Yates proposed to you at the shooting contest? And that you shot a man to save him at the Grand Hotel?" added Miss Thompson, the milliner, her eyes wide with excitement. Lillian sighed internally. News traveled fast in Raton and apparently grew more dramatic in the telling. "Mr. Yates made a jest after the contest," she corrected gently. "And yes, there was an unfortunate incident at dinner, but it was quickly resolved." "He's quite handsome," observed young Betty Clark, the Reverend's daughter, "and he seems very attentive to you." Lillian couldn't deny either observation. She glanced across the churchyard to where Thomas stood talking with her father and several other men. As if sensing her gaze, he looked up, meeting her eyes with a smile that seemed meant only for her. "We are getting acquainted," Lillian said carefully. "Mr. Yates is new to Raton, and my father and I are helping him become established in the community." This bland explanation satisfied no one, judging by the knowing looks exchanged among the women, but it was all Lillian was prepared to share. Her feelings for Thomas were still too new, too complex to discuss, even if she had been inclined toward such confidences. Eventually, George Nash extricated them from the post-service socializing, reminding everyone of ranch duties that couldn't wait. As they left the churchyard, Thomas escorted Lillian back to his buggy. "I've arranged a picnic for our ride," he said, indicating a basket secured in the back of the vehicle. "If that meets with your approval, it sounds perfect," Lillian replied, surprised and pleased by his thoughtfulness. George cleared his throat. "I'll expect you both back at the ranch by sundown," he said, the warning clear in his tone. "Of course, sir," Thomas agreed easily. "I wouldn't dream of keeping Miss Nash out after dark." As they drove away from the church, Lillian felt a strange mixture of excitement and nervousness. This would be their first time truly alone together, without the buffer of her father or the formality of a restaurant. "You handled that very well," she observed as they left the town behind. "Mrs. Peterson is already planning which hymns to sing at our wedding, I'm sure." Thomas laughed, the sound warm and genuine. "Small towns are the same everywhere. Show a man and woman together twice, and they're practically married in the eyes of the community." "Does that bother you?" Lillian asked, curious about his reaction to the scrutiny. Thomas considered the question, his hands steady on the reins. "No," he said finally. "I've lived most of my adult life with people watching me, judging me usually with far less charitable assumptions than marriage prospects. This kind of attention is almost refreshing." The honesty of his answer touched Lillian. She studied his profile as he drove, the strong line of his jaw, the slight crinkles at the corners of his eyes that suggested he smiled often, despite the hardships he must have faced. "Where are we going?" she asked as they turned onto a less traveled trail leading toward the foothills. "There's a spot I discovered a few weeks ago," Thomas replied. "A small meadow near a creek with a view of the mountains. If it doesn't meet with your approval, we can find somewhere else." "I'm sure it will be lovely," Lillian assured him, touched again by his consideration. The meadow, when they reached it, was indeed beautiful, a natural clearing surrounded by pine trees, with a small, clear creek bubbling along one edge. Wildflowers dotted the grass, and the mountains rose majestically in the distance. Thomas helped Lillian from the buggy, his hands strong and sure at her waist. For a moment after her feet touched the ground, they stood close enough that Lillian could see the varying shades of blue in his eyes, could feel the warmth of him even without touching. Then Thomas stepped back, clearing his throat slightly. "Let me get the picnic basket," he said, turning to the buggy. Lillian took the opportunity to explore the meadow, gathering a small bouquet of wildflowers as she walked. The day was perfect, warm but not hot, with a gentle breeze carrying the scents of pine and grass. Thomas spread a blanket near the creek and began unpacking the picnic basket. Lillian was impressed by the contents: fried chicken, fresh bread, a jar of preserves, apples, and even a small cake. "Did Mrs. Ortiz prepare this as well?" she asked, settling on the blanket. Thomas looked slightly embarrassed. "I may have enlisted her help again. My cooking skills are adequate for survival but not for impressing a lady." "Consider me impressed," Lillian said, accepting a plate from him. "Though I hope someday to taste your adequate cooking as well." "Careful what you wish for," Thomas warned with a grin. "My beans and bacon have been known to make grown men weep, and not with joy." They ate companionably, the conversation flowing easily between them. Thomas asked about the ranch, listening intently as Lillian described the challenges of the upcoming cattle drive and her ideas for expanding their breeding program. "You speak about ranching with real passion," he observed. "Have you always wanted to run your father's operation?" Lillian considered the question. "I never really thought about alternatives," she admitted. "After my mother died, it was just father and me. The ranch needed both of us to survive. I learned the business because I had to, but I grew to love it. And now, if you could do anything, would you still choose ranching?" It was a question no one had ever asked her before. Lillian looked out at the mountains, turning the idea over in her mind. "Yes," she said finally, "but on my own terms. I'd like to implement some of the new breeding methods I've read about, expand our operation. Father is more traditional. He believes in doing things the way they've always been done." Thomas nodded, understanding in his eyes. "It's hard to convince a man who's built something from nothing that there might be better ways to do it." "Exactly," Lillian agreed, surprised and pleased by his perception. "But what about you? Is working for the railroad what you want to do?" Thomas leaned back on his elbows, his face thoughtful. "It's a good job," he said slowly. "Steady pay, respectable work. But no, it's not my final destination." "What is then?" Lillian asked, genuinely curious. Thomas met her eyes directly. "I've been saving to start a horse ranch," he revealed. "Not cattle, horses. Breeding, training, selling. I've always had a way with them, and there's good money in quality horses for the army, for ranchers, for the stage lines." The clarity of his vision impressed Lillian. "Is that why you bought the house? As a first step?" "Yes," Thomas nodded. "It came with 10 acres. Not enough for a proper operation, but enough to start building corrals, maybe house a few breeding mares while I save for more land." "It's a good plan," Lillian said, meaning it. Horse breeding was a respectable business and potentially lucrative with the right stock and skills. "I thought so," Thomas agreed. "Though lately I've been considering properties closer to Raton than I originally planned." The implication was clear, and Lillian felt warmth rise to her cheeks. Before she could respond, Thomas changed the subject, asking about her experience with horses and breeding practices. The conversation flowed into technical details, Thomas asking intelligent questions that revealed his own knowledge on the subject. After they finished eating, Thomas suggested a walk along the creek. He offered his hand to help Lillian up from the blanket, and when she took it, he didn't let go immediately. Instead, their fingers remained loosely entwined as they began walking. It was a small intimacy, but significant. Lillian was acutely aware of the warm strength of his hand around hers, the slight roughness of calluses that spoke of work and weapons. "May I ask you something personal?" she said as they reached a bend in the creek where the water pooled deeper, creating a small swimming hole. "Of course," Thomas replied, though she felt a slight tension in his hand. "The men you've killed," Lillian began carefully. "Do you think about them often?" Thomas was silent for so long that Lillian feared she had overstepped. Then he sighed deeply, his gaze fixed on the water. "Yes," he said simply. "Not every day anymore, but often enough, especially at night." Lillian squeezed his hand gently, encouraging him to continue if he wished. "They were all armed men who drew on me first," Thomas said after another pause. "Each one made his choice, and I made mine to survive. I don't regret defending myself or others, but taking a life, it changes you, makes you see yourself differently." "How?" Lillian asked softly. Thomas turned to face her, his eyes serious. "It makes you realize how thin the line is between civilization and chaos. How quickly a moment can turn from ordinary to fatal. Once you know that, truly know it in your bones, you can't unknow it." Lillian nodded, understanding more than he might have expected. Living on the frontier, she had seen death before, from accidents, from disease, from the harsh realities of nature. Though she had never taken a human life, she understood the weight of mortality. "Is that why you want a different path now? A horse ranch, a settled life?" "Partly," Thomas admitted. "I'm 30 years old, Lillian. I've spent most of my adult life drifting, fighting, surviving. I've seen enough violence to know it's not a way to live, just a way to exist. I want more than that now." The raw honesty in his voice touched something deep inside Lillian. Here was a man who had faced his darkest capacities and chosen to move toward light instead, not because it was easy, but because he recognized the cost of the alternative. "Thank you for telling me," she said quietly, "for not pretending to be something you're not." Thomas's smile was tinged with sadness. "I've never been good at pretending. It's a quality that's gotten me into trouble more than once." "I prefer honesty to smooth falsehoods," Lillian assured him. "Even when the honesty isn't pretty, especially then," she replied firmly. "Life isn't always pretty, Thomas. Anyone who pretends otherwise is either sheltered or lying." Thomas looked at her for a long moment, something like wonder in his expression. Then, slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he raised his free hand to touch her cheek. "Lillian Nash," he said softly, "I think you might be the most remarkable woman I've ever met." The touch of his hand, warm against her skin, made Lillian's heart race. They stood close enough that she could see the varying shades of blue in his eyes, could count the laugh lines at their corners. Without conscious decision, she found herself leaning slightly toward him. Thomas's gaze dropped to her lips, then back to her eyes, a question in his expression. When she didn't pull away, he leaned down, closing the distance between them. The kiss was gentle at first, a mere brushing of lips, as if Thomas was giving her every opportunity to reconsider. But when Lillian moved closer, her free hand coming to rest against his chest, he deepened the kiss, his arm sliding around her waist to draw her against him. Lillian had been kissed before, a few stolen moments at harvest dances or town socials, but never like this. Never with this sense of rightness, of connection that went beyond the physical touch. When they finally parted, she felt slightly breathless, her heart pounding in a way that had nothing to do with exertion. "I've been wanting to do that since you knocked down that last target at the shooting contest," Thomas admitted, his voice low. Lillian laughed softly. "Is that why you proposed, to secure kissing privileges?" "Among other reasons," Thomas replied with a smile that made her pulse quicken again. "Though I'm willing to admit the proposal was premature, the sentiment behind it, however." He trailed off, his expression growing serious. "That was genuine, Lillian, and it still is." The declaration hung between them, neither a jest nor a formal proposal, but something in between, an honest statement of his feelings, his intentions. "Thomas," Lillian began, not entirely sure what she wanted to say. He shook his head slightly. "You don't need to respond to that. Not now. We're still getting to know each other. I just wanted you to understand that this," he gestured between them, "isn't casual for me." The sincerity in his voice touched Lillian deeply. In a world where women were often pursued for their property, their connections, or merely their physical attributes, Thomas was offering something different, a relationship based on mutual respect and genuine attraction. "It isn't casual for me either," she admitted, meeting his gaze steadily. "But you're right, we're still learning about each other. I'd like to continue doing that." Thomas's smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. "I was hoping you'd say that." They walked back to the picnic blanket hand in hand, the air between them charged with new awareness. As they packed up the remains of their meal, Lillian found herself stealing glances at Thomas, the capable hands that had held her so gently, the mouth that had kissed her with such care. The ride back to the Nash ranch was filled with comfortable conversation, interspersed with moments of meaningful silence. Thomas told her more about his plans for the horse ranch, while Lillian shared stories of growing up on the cattle operation. By the time they arrived, the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. George Nash was waiting on the porch, his expression carefully neutral as Thomas helped Lillian down from the buggy. "Right on time, Mr. Yates," he observed. "I trust you had a pleasant ride." "Very pleasant, sir," Thomas replied, his tone respectful despite the knowing look George cast between them. "Your daughter is excellent company." "She is that," George agreed. "Will you stay for supper? Mrs. Rodriguez has made enough to feed an extra mouth." The invitation surprised both Lillian and Thomas. It represented a significant step in George's acceptance of Thomas's courtship. "I'd be honored, sir," Thomas replied, genuine pleasure in his voice. As they moved toward the house, Thomas's hand brushed Lillian's briefly, a small touch that carried the promise of everything that had changed between them that afternoon. And though much remained uncertain in their futures, Lillian found herself looking forward to discovering where this unexpected path might lead. Over the following weeks, Thomas became a regular visitor at the Nash ranch. He arrived for Sunday dinners, helped with repairs to the barn roof, and spent hours discussing cattle and horse breeding with George. Gradually, the older man's reservations seemed to ease, especially as he observed Thomas's work ethic and practical knowledge. For Lillian, each day brought a deeper understanding of the complex man who had proposed so impulsively at a shooting contest. Thomas was well-read, with a surprising knowledge of literature that he attributed to long nights on the trail with only books for company. He was unfailingly respectful of her father, but never patronizing toward her, treating her ideas about ranching with genuine interest and consideration. And when they managed brief moments alone walking back from checking the creek boundaries, or sitting on the porch after her father had retired for the evening, Thomas showed another side entirely. His kisses grew more confident, more heated, though he never crossed the boundaries of propriety. He seemed to sense exactly how far Lillian was comfortable going, always pulling back just when the intensity threatened to overwhelm them both. One evening in late May, as they sat on the porch swing watching fireflies begin to emerge in the gathering dusk, Thomas took her hand, his expression unusually serious. "I need to leave town for a few weeks," he said, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "The railroad has asked me to accompany a payroll shipment to Santa Fe and oversee security improvements there." Disappointment washed through Lillian, stronger than she had expected. "When do you leave?" "Day after tomorrow," Thomas replied. "I should be gone 3 weeks, perhaps 4, depending on how the work goes." "I'll miss you," Lillian admitted, the words coming easily despite their relative newness to each other's lives. Thomas's smile was warm but tinged with something that might have been nervousness. "Before I go, there's something I wanted to ask you properly this time, not in front of half the town after a shooting contest." Lillian's heart began to beat faster as Thomas shifted to face her more fully. "I'm not a perfect man, Lillian Nash," he said, his voice low and sincere. "I've made mistakes. I've lived a harder life than most. But these past weeks with you have shown me the kind of future I want, one with purpose, with roots, with love." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small box, opening it to reveal a simple but elegant gold ring set with a single pearl. "I'm asking you, with a clear head and my whole heart, will you marry me? Not because you can outshoot me, though that remains impressive," he added with a smile that didn't quite hide the vulnerability in his eyes, "but because I love you, and I believe we could build something remarkable together." Lillian stared at the ring, then at Thomas's face, earnest, hopeful, so different from the dangerous gunslinger she had first perceived him to be. In the weeks they had spent together, she had come to know the man beneath the reputation thoughtful, intelligent, determined to create a better life than his past might have suggested. And somewhere along the way, without quite realizing the moment it happened, she had fallen in love with him. "Yes," she said, the word emerging as a whisper before she cleared her throat and repeated more firmly. "Yes, Thomas Yates, I will marry you." The joy that transformed his face was answer enough to any lingering doubts she might have harbored. Thomas slipped the ring onto her finger, then cupped her face in his hands, kissing her with a tenderness that made her heart ache. "I'll speak to your father before I leave," he promised when they finally parted. "Do the thing properly." "He'll say yes," Lillian assured him, though in truth she wasn't entirely certain. George Nash had warmed to Thomas, but marriage was a different matter entirely. "I hope so," Thomas replied. "But regardless of his answer, I'm coming back for you, Lillian. Nothing could keep me away." The certainty in his voice settled something inside her, a fear she hadn't fully acknowledged that this happiness might somehow slip away. Thomas Yates had become the center of a future she hadn't known she wanted until he proposed at that shooting contest, grinning wide with the audacity of it. Now, with his ring on her finger and his promise in her heart, Lillian knew that her life had irrevocably changed course, and she couldn't wait to see where it led. Thomas's conversation with George Nash the following morning was private, conducted in the ranch office while Lillian pretended to be absorbed in household accounts at the kitchen table. When they emerged, her father's expression was unreadable, but Thomas wore a smile that told her everything she needed to know. "Your father has given his blessing," Thomas confirmed as George disappeared toward the barn, ostensibly to check on a new calf. "Though not without extracting several promises from me regarding your continued happiness and well-being." "I would expect nothing less," Lillian replied, relief washing through her. "What did you promise him?" Thomas took her hand, his thumb brushing over the pearl ring. "That I would always respect you as an equal partner, that I would support your involvement in whatever ranch operations we establish together, that I would never stand between you and your father." He paused, a hint of amusement in his eyes. "And that I would never suggest moving more than a half-day's ride from the Nash ranch." Lillian laughed, touched by her father's concern for her happiness even in the specifics of his demands. "He's been afraid of losing me since Mother died," she explained. It took years before he would even let me ride to town alone. I understand, Thomas said seriously. He's protected what he loves most in this world. I can only hope to be worthy of sharing that responsibility with him. The words, simple but profound, brought tears to Lillian's eyes. Thomas pulled her gently into his arms, holding her close as she blinked back the unexpected emotion. "I love you, Lillian Nash," he murmured against her hair. "And I promise you won't regret saying yes." 2 days later, Thomas departed for Santa Fe. The separation was harder than Lillian had anticipated. She had grown accustomed to his presence, his laughter at the dinner table, his help with ranch chores, the quiet moments they stole together. The pearl ring on her finger was both comfort and reminder, catching the light as she went about her daily tasks. News of their engagement spread quickly through Raton. Mrs. Peterson arrived at the ranch bearing a cake and numerous suggestions for the wedding ceremony. The milliner, Miss Thompson, cornered Lillian in town to discuss the latest wedding fashions she could order from Denver. Even Sheriff Wilson offered gruff congratulations, assuring her that despite his past, Thomas Yates was a good man at heart. 3 weeks after Thomas's departure, a letter arrived from Santa Fe. His work was proceeding well, he wrote, but would take longer than anticipated. The railroad had uncovered more security issues than expected, and he had been asked to stay an additional 2 weeks to implement solutions. "I think about you constantly," he wrote in a passage that Lillian read and reread until the paper began to wear at the creases. "Each day away confirms what I already knew, that my life is now measured by the time spent with you and the time spent waiting to return to you. I am counting the hours until I can hold you again." The words sustained her through the long days of ranch work and the longer nights of missing him. June brought the beginning of the summer heat, and with it the increased pace of ranch activities. Lillian threw herself into the work, grateful for the distraction. Then, a month after Thomas's departure, trouble arrived at the Nash ranch in the form of 3 hard-faced men on lathered horses. Lillian was in the barn when they rode in, but she heard their demands from where she stood, loud voices calling for Thomas Yates. Moving cautiously to the barn door, she saw her father standing on the porch, shotgun held casually but visibly at his side. "Mr. Yates isn't here," George was saying, his voice level but unyielding. "And I'd appreciate it if you gentlemen would state your business and move along. This is private property." The leader of the 3 men, a tall figure with a scar running from temple to jaw, sneered visibly. "Our business is with Yates. Word is he's engaged to your daughter. We'll wait." "You'll do no such thing," George replied, shifting the shotgun slightly. "Mr. Yates is away on business and won't return for some time. Whatever quarrel you have with him can be addressed in town through proper channels." The scarred man laughed, an ugly sound. "Proper channels? That's rich. Yates killed my brother in cold blood, old man. The only proper channel for that is justice." Lillian's heart began to pound. Another vengeful relative, like Jenkins at the Grand Hotel. But Thomas wasn't here to diffuse this situation. It was just her father facing 3 armed men with obvious ill intent. Moving quietly, Lillian reached for the rifle that hung on pegs inside the barn door. She checked that it was loaded, then positioned herself where she could see the confrontation while remaining partially concealed. "I suggest you take your grievances to Sheriff Wilson in Raton," George was saying, his tone hardening. "Now, for the last time, I'm asking you to leave my property." "Or what, old man?" the scarred man challenged, his hand dropping to hover near his holstered gun. "You gonna shoot all 3 of us before we drop you?" "He won't have to," Lillian called, stepping partially into view with the rifle raised to her shoulder. "I've got a clear shot at you from here, mister, And unlike my father, I won't aim for your leg first." The three men's heads whipped toward her, surprise evident in their expressions. The scarred leader recovered quickly, his face twisting into a mocking smile. "Well, look here, boys. Yates's woman is as trigger-happy as he is." "I'm an excellent shot," Lillian corrected, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. "And I don't want bloodshed on my property, but I will protect my father and my home." A tense silence fell over the yard. The scarred man's companions looked less certain now, glancing between their leader and the two armed Nashes. "This isn't over," the scarred man said finally, though he removed his hand from near his gun. "Yates can't hide behind a woman forever." "Mr. Yates isn't hiding from anyone," Lillian replied firmly. "He's away on legitimate business. When he returns, I'm sure Sheriff Wilson would be happy to mediate any grievances, assuming they're legitimate and not just excuses for murder." The barb hit home. The scarred man's face darkened with anger. For a moment, Lillian thought he might reach for his weapon despite the danger. Then one of his companions leaned over to mutter something, and the tension seemed to drain slightly from his posture. "We'll be in town," he said, gathering his reins. "Tell Yates that Carson Blackburn is looking for him. He'll know the name." With that, the three men turned their horses and rode away, dust billowing behind them. Lillian didn't lower the rifle until they disappeared from view. Then, her hands trembling slightly with the aftermath of adrenaline, she walked to join her father on the porch. "Are you all right?" she asked, noting the tight lines around his mouth. George nodded grimly. "I'm fine. But this is exactly what I feared, Lillian. Thomas's past following you both even when he tries to leave it behind. It's not his fault that men like that refuse to accept the law's judgment," Lillian argued. "Thomas has never denied killing in self-defense. He's faced proper inquiries and been cleared." "That may satisfy the law," George replied, "but blood feuds don't recognize legal distinctions. Men like Blackburn don't care about self-defense or justification. They only see that their kin is dead and someone needs to pay." Lillian couldn't deny the truth of this. The frontier justice system was imperfect at best, and many chose to seek vengeance outside its boundaries. "We should send word to Thomas," she said after a moment. "Warn him about Blackburn." George nodded agreement. "I'll ride into town tomorrow, send a telegram. And I'll speak to Sheriff Wilson about those three. He should know trouble's brewing." That night, Lillian lay awake long after her father had gone to bed, turning her engagement ring around her finger as she considered the day's events. The confrontation had shaken her more than she wanted to admit. Not because of any fear for herself, but because it confirmed her father's warnings about Thomas's past, how violence seemed to follow him, even as he tried to build a different life. For the first time since accepting Thomas's proposal, doubt crept into Lillian's mind. Not about her love for him, which remained steady and true, but about the life they might build together. Would they always be looking over their shoulders, waiting for the next vengeful relative or old enemy to appear? Could they raise children, run a ranch, build a future with such shadows constantly looming? She had no answers, only questions that chased themselves in circles until exhaustion finally pulled her into uneasy sleep. The following day, George rode into Raton as promised, returning with news that Sheriff Wilson would keep an eye on Blackburn and his companions. He had also sent a telegram to Thomas in Santa Fe, warning him about the threat. "Wilson knows Blackburn," George reported as they sat at the dinner table. "Says he's a troublemaker from Texas with a reputation for settling scores. His brother was wanted for murder in 3 states before Thomas shot him during that payroll robbery last year." "Then it was justified," Lillian said, relief evident in her voice. "Thomas was protecting the payroll, doing his job. According to the law, yes, George agreed. But men like Blackburn make their own law. The next 3 days passed in tense watchfulness. George insisted that Lillian carry a pistol whenever she left the house, and they took turns standing guard at night. By the 4th day, with no sign of Blackburn returning to the ranch, they began to relax slightly. Perhaps he had decided to wait for Thomas's return rather than harassing his future family. Then, at dawn on the 5th day, Lillian woke to the smell of smoke. She bolted from her bed, rushing to the window to see flames licking up the side of the barn. Grabbing her robe, she ran to her father's room, pounding on the door. "Fire!" she shouted. "The barn's on fire!" George emerged instantly, already pulling on his boots. "Wake Mrs. Rodriguez," he ordered. "Then start the pump. I'll get the horses out." Lillian raced to alert their housekeeper, then ran outside to the water pump, her heart pounding with fear. The barn was already half engulfed, flames reaching hungrily toward the hayloft where they stored feed for the winter. For the next hour, Lillian, her father, and Mrs. Rodriguez fought desperately to contain the blaze. They managed to save the horses and most of the equipment, but the barn itself was a total loss, reduced to smoldering timbers and ash by the time the sun fully rose. As they stood surveying the damage, exhausted and soot-covered, George picked up something from the ground near what had been the barn door, a piece of cloth soaked in kerosene, clear evidence of arson. "Blackburn," he said grimly, showing Lillian the incriminating item. "This is a message for Thomas." Lillian stared at the ruins of the barn, anger building inside her. This was more than a message, it was an attack on their livelihood, their security. If the wind had been blowing differently, the fire could have spread to the house, endangering all their lives. "We're going to town," she announced, her voice hard with determination. "Today. I won't wait for another message that might kill us all." George didn't argue. After cleaning up and changing into fresh clothes, they rode to Raton together, heading directly for Sheriff Wilson's office. The sheriff listened to their account with growing concern, examining the kerosene-soaked cloth they had brought as evidence. "This is serious," he acknowledged. "Arson, destruction of property, these are hanging offenses, but proving Blackburn did it." He shook his head. "Unless you saw him, it's just suspicion." "It was him," Lillian insisted. "Who else would target our barn just days after threatening us?" Sheriff Wilson sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "I'll bring him in for questioning, but without evidence or witnesses, I can't hold him long." "And in the meantime, what?" George demanded. "We wait for him to burn down our house next, shoot us in our beds." "I'll assign a deputy to patrol near your property," the sheriff offered. "And I've sent another telegram to Thomas, urging him to return as soon as possible." "This is his fight more than yours." "It became our fight when they burned our barn," Lillian said firmly. As they left the sheriff's office, Lillian noticed a familiar buggy outside the telegraph office across the street. Her heart leaped as she recognized Thomas's bay gelding. "Father," she said, touching George's arm, "Thomas is here." They crossed the street quickly, entering the telegraph office to find Thomas standing at the counter, reading a message with a grim expression. He looked up at their entrance, relief washing over his features. "Lillian, Mr. Nash," he said, moving quickly to embrace her, propriety forgotten in his concern. "I just arrived and found the sheriff's telegram. Are you both all right?" "We're unharmed," Lillian assured him, drawing comfort from his solid presence. "But our barn is gone, burned to the ground this morning." Thomas's expression darkened with anger. "Blackburn," he said, not a question but a certainty. "The sheriff's telegram mentioned he was in town making threats." "We're almost sure it was him," George confirmed. "Though we didn't see him do it." Thomas released Lillian gently, his posture changing subtly, becoming more alert, more watchful. "Where is he now?" "Sheriff Wilson is looking for him," Lillian explained. "He's going to bring him in for questioning, but without evidence." "I understand," Thomas said, his voice hard. "This is my responsibility. I'll deal with Blackburn." The way he said it sent a chill through Lillian. This wasn't the Thomas who had courted her with picnics and chess games. This was the gunman from his past, emerging in response to the threat. "Thomas," she said quietly, laying a hand on his arm. "We need to handle this through the law. If you confront Blackburn directly, if I don't," Thomas interrupted, his eyes meeting hers, "he'll keep coming after what's mine, after who's mine. I won't risk your safety, Lillian, not for anything." Before she could respond, the door to the telegraph office burst open. Sheriff Wilson stood there, his expression grave. "Yates," he said. "Thought I might find you here. Blackburn's at the saloon. He's drunk, armed, and asking for you. Says he's going to settle things today one way or another." Thomas nodded once, as if he had expected nothing less. "Keep them here," he told the sheriff, gesturing to Lillian and her father. "This is between Blackburn and me." "Like hell it is," George said, stepping forward. "The man burned down my barn. I've got as much right to face him as you do." "And he did it because of me," Thomas countered. "Mr. Nash, please stay with Lillian. I couldn't bear it if anything happened to either of you because of my past." The sincerity in his voice was impossible to doubt. George hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "Be careful, son. Men like Blackburn don't fight fair." "I know," Thomas replied grimly. "That's why I need to end this now before it gets worse." He turned to Lillian, his expression softening as he gazed at her. "I'll come back to you," he promised, his voice low. "We'll rebuild the barn, we'll build our future. Just trust me to handle this first." Lillian wanted to protest, to insist on accompanying him, but she recognized the determination in his eyes. This was Thomas reclaiming his past, facing it directly so it couldn't threaten their future. "I trust you," she said simply. Thomas kissed her quickly, then turned to follow Sheriff Wilson toward the saloon. Lillian and George exchanged glances then, by unspoken agreement, followed at a distance. Neither was willing to stay safely behind while Thomas faced danger alone. The main street of Raton had cleared as word spread of the impending confrontation. Shopkeepers stood in doorways, watching nervously as Thomas and the sheriff approached the saloon. Blackburn's two companions lounged outside, straightening as they spotted Thomas. "He's waiting for you," one of them called, a smirk on his face. "Says to come in alone." "Not happening," Sheriff Wilson replied before Thomas could speak. "I'm coming in too. This ends peacefully, or the only place Blackburn's going is a jail cell or a pine box." The men exchanged glances but stepped aside. Thomas paused at the entrance, his posture straight and confident despite the danger that awaited him. Then, with a nod to the sheriff, he pushed through the swinging doors. Lillian and George had reached a vantage point across the street, close enough to see but partially shielded by the overhang of the general store. From there, they could see through the saloon's windows as Thomas entered. Blackburn sat at a table in the center of the otherwise empty room, a bottle of whiskey and a revolver before him. He looked up as Thomas approached, his scarred face twisting into an ugly smile. "Finally decided to show your face, Yates," he called, his words slightly slurred from drink. "Thought you might hide behind that woman of yours forever." "I don't hide behind anyone," Thomas replied, his voice carrying clearly through the open windows. "And burning down an innocent man's barn is the act of a coward, Blackburn." Blackburn's smile disappeared. "My brother wasn't given a fair chance. Why should you get one?" "Your brother was robbing a payroll, Blackburn. He shot a guard before I even drew my weapon. Every witness confirmed it." "Witnesses lie," Blackburn snarled. "Money talks, and now you're going to pay for what you did." His hand moved toward the gun on the table. Sheriff Wilson stepped forward, his own weapon already drawn. "Don't do it, Blackburn. This doesn't have to end in bloodshed." Blackburn hesitated, his eyes darting between Thomas and the sheriff. "You're protecting him," he accused Wilson. "Just like the law always protects its own." "I'm protecting the peace in my town," Wilson corrected. "Yates was cleared by a proper investigation. Your brother died committing a crime. Those are the facts, whether you accept them or not." For a moment, it seemed Blackburn might back down. His hand hovered near the gun, not quite touching it. Then his gaze shifted past Thomas to the window directly to where Lillian stood watching. A slow, malicious smile spread across his face. "Pretty thing," he commented. "Be a shame if something happened to her because of you, Yates." The implied threat hung in the air like gunsmoke. Thomas's posture changed subtly, a tightening of his shoulders, a shift of his weight forward. "This is your only warning, Blackburn," he said, his voice deadly quiet. "Leave Raton. Leave Lillian Nash and her father alone. Find somewhere else to nurse your grievances." "Or what?" Blackburn challenged, his hand closing around the revolver. "Or I'll send you to join your brother," Thomas replied simply, the moment balanced on a knife's edge. Lillian held her breath, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure everyone must hear it. Then Blackburn made his choice. His hand flashed upward, the revolver rising toward Thomas. But Thomas was faster, impossibly fast. His gun seemed to materialize in his hand, firing once before Blackburn's weapon was fully raised. The sound of the shot echoed through the saloon and out onto the street. Blackburn looked down at the red stain spreading across his shirt, an expression of surprise on his face. Then he toppled sideways, the unfired revolver clattering to the floor beside him. Sheriff Wilson knelt quickly beside the fallen man, checking for signs of life. After a moment, he looked up at Thomas and shook his head. "Clean shot," he said. "He drew first. Everyone here saw it." Thomas holstered his weapon slowly, his expression unreadable. Then he turned and walked out of the saloon, his gaze immediately finding Lillian across the street. For a heartbeat, she feared what she might see in his eyes: bloodlust, satisfaction, or worse, nothing at all. But what she found there was only sorrow and weariness, the weight of having taken another life, even in self-defense. Without hesitation, Lillian crossed to him, taking his hand in hers. "Let's go home," she said softly. Thomas looked down at their joined hands, then back to her face. "Even after seeing that?" he asked, his voice low. "Even knowing what I'm capable of?" "I've always known," Lillian replied steadily. "Just as I know you tried to avoid it. He gave you no choice, Thomas." George joined them, placing a hand on Thomas's shoulder. "She's right, son. We both saw what happened. You did what you had to do." Thomas nodded slowly, the tension gradually easing from his frame. "I wanted a different outcome," he admitted. "A different ending to this story." "I know," Lillian assured him. "But sometimes we don't get to choose our endings, only how we respond to them." As they walked together toward their waiting horses, Blackburn's companions watched from the boardwalk, their expressions unreadable. One stepped forward as if to speak, then thought better of it at Sheriff Wilson's warning look. "Will they cause more trouble?" Lillian asked quietly as Thomas helped her onto her horse. "I don't think so," he replied. "Men like that respect the outcome of a fair fight, even if they don't like it." And without Blackburn leading them. He shrugged. They'll move on, find another cause, or go back to whatever they were doing before he recruited them. The ride back to the Nash ranch was largely silent, each of them absorbed in their own thoughts. When they arrived, Thomas dismounted quickly to help Lillian down, his hands lingering at her waist. "I'm sorry about the barn," he said, looking at the blackened ruins. "I'll help rebuild it, better than before." "We know you will," George replied before Lillian could speak. But first, I think we all need some rest. It's been a long day." Inside the house, Mrs. Rodriguez fussed over them, providing hot coffee and food despite the late hour. Thomas ate little, his gaze often drifting to the window to the barn's remains visible in the moonlight. When George finally retired for the night, leaving them alone in the kitchen, Thomas took Lillian's hand across the table. "I understand if today changes things between us," he said quietly. "If you need time to reconsider our engagement, stop," Lillian interrupted, tightening her grip on his hand. "Today showed me exactly who you are, Thomas Yates. A man who tries to avoid violence but won't hesitate to protect what matters. A man who takes no pleasure in killing but accepts the burden when necessary." Thomas studied her face, searching for any sign of doubt or fear. "And that's the man you still want to marry, knowing that my past may never fully release me." "That's the man I love," Lillian confirmed. "And yes, that's the man I want to marry. The past is part of who we are, Thomas. I don't expect you to erase it, only to move forward with me, building something new." The relief in Thomas's expression was palpable. He raised her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. "I don't deserve you," he murmured, "but I'll spend the rest of my life trying to." "We deserve each other," Lillian corrected gently. "Two stubborn people who know their own minds and hearts." Thomas smiled, the first genuine smile since the confrontation with Blackburn. "When did you get so wise, Lillian Nash?" "Somewhere between beating you at that shooting contest and watching you face down a vengeful killer," she replied with a small smile of her own. "It's been an educational few months." That drew a soft laugh from Thomas, the sound easing the last of the tension between them. "Speaking of education," he said, his tone lightening, "I've been thinking about wedding dates. Unless you've changed your mind about a long engagement," Lillian considered the question seriously. After the events of the day, the idea of waiting months to begin their life together seemed suddenly unnecessary. "I think," she said slowly, "that we've faced enough tests of our commitment. A short engagement sounds perfect." "How short?" Thomas asked, hope kindling in his eyes. 2 weeks. Lillian suggested. "Long enough to rebuild the basics of the barn and prepare a proper ceremony, but not so long that something else can interrupt our plans." Thomas's smile widened. 2 weeks, he agreed. "I can have the foundation laid by tomorrow evening." Lillian laughed at his eagerness, though she shared it. "Don't you need to notify the railroad that you won't be returning to Santa Fe?" "Already done," Thomas revealed. "Before I left, I told them it would be my final assignment. I've saved enough for a good start on the horse ranch, and with the sale of some properties I held in Colorado coming through next month." He shrugged. "We'll be comfortable, Lillian. Not wealthy, but secure." The casual confidence with which he spoke of their future together warmed Lillian's heart. Despite everything, the violence, the destruction, the lingering shadows of his past, Thomas was looking forward, planning for the life they would build together. 2 weeks, she repeated, sealing the decision. And then Mrs. Thomas Yates. The next 2 weeks passed in a whirlwind of activity. True to his word, Thomas had the barn's foundation laid by the following evening, working alongside George and hired men from town. The structure rose quickly, with neighbors and friends coming to help, a traditional barn raising that brought the community together. Wedding preparations moved at an equally rapid pace. Lillian ordered fabric for a simple but elegant dress, which Mrs. Rodriguez and several women from town helped sew. Thomas arranged for a justice of the peace from Trinidad to perform the ceremony, as Reverend Clark was away visiting family. Through it all, there was a sense of rightness, of pieces falling into place as they should. Even George seemed to fully accept Thomas now, working beside him during the day and sharing stories over whiskey in the evenings. The night before the wedding, as Lillian stood in her bedroom looking at the completed dress hanging on her wardrobe door, a soft knock sounded. "Come in," she called, expecting Mrs. Rodriguez with last-minute details. Instead, her father entered, looking uncharacteristically uncertain. In his hands, he held a small wooden box that Lillian recognized immediately her mother's jewelry case. "I thought you might want this for tomorrow," George said, setting the box on her dressing table. "Your mother would have wanted you to have it." Lillian opened the box carefully. Inside lay a delicate gold chain with a small sapphire pendant, her mother's most treasured possession, worn only on special occasions. "It's beautiful," she whispered, lifting it gently. "Thank you, Father." George cleared his throat, clearly emotional but trying to hide it. "Your mother would be proud of the woman you've become, Lillian. Strong, independent, making your own choices." He paused, then added gruffly, "I'm proud of you too." Tears pricked Lillian's eyes. Her father had never been a demonstrative man, rarely expressing his feelings directly. This acknowledgement on the eve of her wedding was a gift as precious as the necklace. "I learned from the best," she said, rising to embrace him. "Everything I am, I learned from you and Mother." George returned the hug awkwardly but sincerely. "Yates is a good man," he said as they separated. "Better than I first thought. He'll take care of you." "And I'll take care of him," Lillian replied with a smile. "We'll take care of each other." Her father nodded, understanding the distinction. Lillian Nash had never needed a protector, only a partner who respected her strength while offering his own. The wedding day dawned clear and bright, as if nature itself approved of the union. The ceremony was held on the Nash ranch, beneath an arch of flowers erected near the newly rebuilt barn, a symbol of destruction overcome and new beginnings. Lillian wore her mother's sapphire pendant with her simple white dress, her hair arranged in an elegant twist adorned with wildflowers. As George walked her toward the arch where Thomas waited, she saw only her future husband, tall and handsome in a new suit, his eyes never leaving her face. The justice of the peace spoke the traditional words, but it was the vows Thomas and Lillian had written themselves that moved the assembled guests to tears. "Lillian Nash," Thomas said, his voice steady and sure. "From the moment you outshot me at that contest, I knew you were someone extraordinary. You've seen the worst of me and the best of me, and somehow found value in both. I promise to be your partner in all things, to respect your strength while offering mine, to build a life with you founded on honesty and trust. I love you, not despite who you are, but because of it." Lillian blinked back tears as she spoke her own vows. "Thomas Yates, when you proposed to me minutes after I beat you at shooting, I thought you were either mad or making fun. Now I know you simply recognized what I didn't yet see, that we are perfectly matched, in skill and in spirit. I promise to stand beside you through whatever life brings, to face challenges together rather than alone, to build a future that honors both our pasts without being limited by them. I love you, completely and without reservation." When the justice pronounced them husband and wife, Thomas's kiss was both tender and promising a beginning rather than an ending. The celebration that followed was joyful and relaxed. Tables had been set up near the house, laden with food prepared by Mrs. Rodriguez and the women of the town. Music filled the air as a local fiddler played dancing tunes, and laughter flowed as freely as the wine and whiskey. As evening fell and lanterns were lit around the yard, Thomas pulled Lillian aside, leading her toward the corral where the horses were kept. "I have something to show you," he said, an excited gleam in his eye. "A wedding gift." Inside the corral stood a horse Lillian hadn't seen before, a magnificent chestnut mare with intelligent eyes and perfect conformation. "This is Duchess," Thomas said, pride evident in his voice. the foundation of our breeding program. She's carrying a foal by one of the best stallions in Colorado due next spring." Lillian approached the mare slowly, admiring her lines and the gentle way she lowered her head to be petted. "She's beautiful," she breathed. "Perfect." "Like her new mistress," Thomas replied with a smile. "I thought we might start building the horse operation here on Nash land if your father agrees. We could use the southeastern pasture, construct proper facilities over time." The suggestion surprised Lillian. "You'd be willing to build here rather than on your own property," Thomas nodded. "My land is good but smaller. Here we'd have room to expand, access to better water, established ranch infrastructure. And—" he hesitated, then added softly, "it would mean you wouldn't have to leave your home." The consideration behind the offer touched Lillian deeply. Thomas was willing to adapt his dreams to accommodate hers, to merge their futures, rather than expecting her to abandon her past. "I think that's a wonderful idea," she said, stepping into his arms. "Father would be delighted to have us stay, and it makes practical sense too." "Practical and romantic," Thomas agreed, holding her close. "The perfect combination, like us." As they returned to the celebration hand in hand, Lillian felt a profound sense of rightness, as if all the unexpected turns in her life had been leading to this moment, this man, this future they would build together. The shooting contest that had brought them together seemed both recent and distant now, a pivotal moment that had set everything else in motion. Thomas's impulsive proposal, delivered with that wide, confident grin, "Marry me before someone else does," had been prescient in ways neither of them could have imagined at the time. Now, as Mrs. Thomas Yates, Lillian looked forward to all the contests, challenges, and triumphs they would face together, equal partners in the adventure of their shared life. Epilogue. 5 years later, the sound of childish laughter floated through the open windows of the Nash Yates ranch house as Lillian finished hanging laundry in the summer sunshine. She paused, smiling as she watched her 3-year-old son, George, chasing chickens across the yard while his father pretended to help, but was clearly encouraging the mischief. Thomas caught her watching and grinned, that same wide, confident smile that had captivated her 5 years ago at the shooting contest. Though a few strands of silver now threaded through his dark hair at the temples, he looked younger. Somehow the weight of his past gradually eased by the joy of their present. "Mama, look," George called, holding up a feather triumphantly. "Chicken present." "Very nice, sweetheart," Lillian called back, suppressing a laugh at her son's solemn pride in his trophy. Thomas scooped the boy onto his shoulders, striding toward Lillian with his precious cargo. "Mrs. Yates," he greeted her with a kiss. "I believe this young man has been promised a trip to see the new foal." "Has he indeed?" Lillian replied, raising an eyebrow at her husband. "And would his father happen to be eager for the same trip? Purely coincidental," Thomas assured her with a wink. "Though I do think Midnight's filly might be our best yet." Lillian couldn't disagree. The horse breeding operation they had established on Nash land had flourished beyond their expectations. Starting with Duchess and 2 other quality mares, they now had a reputation throughout the territory for producing exceptional stock. The Army had recently contracted with them for cavalry mounts, and ranchers from as far as Texas sought their breeding horses. "Let me finish here and we'll all go," she promised. "Father will want to see her too." As if summoned by his name, George Nash appeared from the direction of the cattle pastures, riding slowly but steadily despite his advancing years. At 57, he had gradually handed more of the cattle operation to Lillian and Thomas, though he remained actively involved in all ranch decisions. "Grandpa," young George shouted from his perch on Thomas's shoulders, waving enthusiastically. The older man's weathered face creased in a smile as he dismounted, moving to ruffle his grandson's hair. "Been chasing chickens again, I see," he observed, nodding toward the feather still clutched in the boy's hand. "Helping Mama," the child corrected seriously. "Chickens make eggs better when they exercise." This explanation, clearly repeated from something Thomas had told him, drew laughter from all three adults. Young George beamed at their response, pleased with his contribution to the conversation. "We're going to see the new foal," Lillian explained to her father. "Would you like to join us?" "Wouldn't miss it," George replied. "Heard from Rodriguez that she's a beauty." Together, the family walked toward the horse barn, a sturdy, well-designed structure that had replaced the utilitarian building burned by Blackburn years before. Inside, the scents of hay, horse, and leather created a familiar, comforting atmosphere. In the largest stall, a coal-black mare stood protectively over her day-old foal, a delicate creature with perfectly formed lines and a distinctive white star on her forehead. "She's magnificent," Lillian murmured, leaning against the stall door beside Thomas, who had set their son down to peek through the slats. "Midnight outdid herself this time." Thomas nodded agreement, professional pride evident in his expression. "Strong legs, good chest, intelligent eyes. She'll bring top dollar when she's trained." "If we sell her," George Nash commented with a knowing look at his daughter. "I've seen how you've been watching this one, Lillian." Lillian smiled, not bothering to deny it. "She has something special. I think she might be worth keeping for our own breeding program." "Woman has an eye for quality," Thomas said to his father-in-law with mock resignation. "Can't argue with her instincts." This was an old, comfortable joke between them, Lillian's uncanny ability to spot potential in horses that others might overlook. It was one of many ways she contributed to their shared business, alongside Thomas's expertise in training and her father's knowledge of the market. Young George, growing restless with the adult conversation, tugged at his mother's skirt. "Baby horse name?" he asked. Lillian looked to Thomas, who gestured for her to decide. "What do you think of Starlight?" she suggested, "for the mark on her forehead." The boy considered this seriously, then nodded approval. "Starlight," he repeated carefully. "Pretty horse." As they left the barn, Thomas's arm slipped around Lillian's waist, a casual intimacy that still sent warmth through her after 5 years of marriage. She leaned into him slightly, grateful for the solid strength of his presence. Life had not been without challenges since their wedding day. There had been drought years that tested the ranch's resources, a difficult pregnancy that had confined Lillian to bed for months before George's birth. And occasionally, echoes of Thomas's past that required addressing. But through it all, they had remained true to their vows, facing difficulties together, building their future side by side. The Nash Yates Ranch had become known not just for its fine horses and quality cattle, but as a home where visitors were always welcome, where laughter flowed freely, and where a former gunslinger and a sharpshooting woman had created something remarkable together. That evening, after young George had been tucked into bed with stories of brave horses and clever cowboys, Lillian and Thomas sat on the porch swing, watching stars emerge in the vast New Mexico sky. The same swing where he had proposed to her properly, 5 years and a lifetime ago. "Happy?" Thomas asked, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her shoulder. Lillian smiled, leaning her head against him. "Completely. You, more than I ever thought possible," he admitted. "Sometimes I still can't believe how lucky I was that day at the shooting contest. Lucky that I beat you." Lillian teased. Thomas laughed softly. "Lucky that I had the sense to recognize what I'd found. A woman who could outshoot me, outthink me, and somehow still love me despite knowing exactly who I was." Who you were, Lillian corrected gently. You're not that man anymore, Thomas. You haven't been for a long time. He was quiet for a moment, considering her words. No, he agreed finally. I'm not. Thanks to you, I'm someone better. We made each other better, Lillian said, turning to face him. That's what marriage is supposed to do, isn't it? Help us become our best selves. Thomas smiled, that same wide, confident grin that had accompanied his impulsive proposal years ago. Wise as always, Mrs. Yates, he murmured, leaning in to kiss her beneath the star-filled sky. As Lillian returned his kiss, she reflected on the unexpected path her life had taken from a young woman determined to prove herself in a man's world to a wife, mother, and successful businesswoman, who had found a partner who valued her strength, rather than feeling threatened by it. The shooting contest that had brought them together seemed like both yesterday and a lifetime ago, a moment of perfect aim that had changed everything. Thomas's proposal, offered with that unforgettable grin, "Marry me before someone else does," had been the beginning of an adventure more fulfilling than either of them could have imagined. And as the stars continued their silent journey across the New Mexico sky, Lillian and Thomas Yates rocked gently on their porch swing, secure in the knowledge that whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, they would face them together, equal partners, perfect matches, in love and in life.